My name is Elisa Giuliani. I'm full professor of management at the University of Pisa, where I direct a research center on responsible management and sustainable development. And I'm currently also visiting professor at Bocconi University. My research lies at the intersection between economic geography, international business, development studies, and innovation studies. In the early phases of my career, I used to work on processes of technology transfer, especially in terms of how firms in developing countries learned and upgraded technologically. And I was investigating processes of technological catching up and how firms in those contexts, especially in Latin America, would create new knowledge and innovate and manage to catch up. So more recently, I've become interested in understanding the societal implications of companies' operations. And the reason for that is that we are seeing that contemporary capitalism is facing some big sustainability challenges, some of which are unprecedented. So it's not just about climate change, but it's also about how companies conduct their business that sometimes involves modern slavery, child labor, or the exploitations of workers and communities. And all this, there is growing evidence that this is occurring. And so I became interested in understanding how companies would be related to those problems. They would be exacerbating those problems, or even in understanding how they could fix those problems. Also, I think contemporary capitalism is facing two twins problems and threats. On the one hand, these business-related human rights infringements, so the involvement of companies in violations of human rights, but also we are seeing increasing economic inequality within countries, and particularly we are seeing and we are witnessing the extreme wealth and extreme income, which means that we are observing the rise of millionaires and billionaires and the rise of ultra-rich. And this rise is also due to companies' operations, essentially to the corporate governance decisions that companies take in terms of their distributive policies. So how much they reward their, what I call corporate elites, how much they reward their CEOs and executives, or it's an important issue that I think should be connected to how they conduct their business. Because if on the one hand, they conduct business by infringing on the rights of different sets of communities, and on the other, they overly reward their corporate elites, I think we have a big problem. And I think we need to investigate that type of relationship more thoroughly. One problem that we have when working with these type of issues is about measurement. How do we measure the harmful impacts that companies generate on society and the environment and human rights at large? Let me say that in my research I focus on universal human rights because we are seeing that big business is global. So large multinational corporations, for instance, operate across geographies, and therefore to us and to my research team, human rights defined by the UN Declaration of Human Rights is an important reference point in terms of defining what is wrong and what is right in terms of business conduct. And so clearly measuring human rights infringements is not as easy as measuring innovation. It's a very complex process, and we have embarked into that over the last 10 years or so in my research center, and we have tried to codify events of business-related human rights infringements for a sample of large public companies worldwide. So we've coded that and georeferenced events, specific events. So if a company has contaminated the water of a particular territory with cadmium and the people get sick out of it, we would code that. If a company uses child labor in its value chain, then we will code that. So we have tracked this over approximately 400 companies over the last 30 years or so, and we have created this big data set on that. Of course, these data are not the best data an economist would dream of working on, because it's highly likely that we are missing a lot of information, that we are having a lot of false negatives, but we are trying to really cover what is known about these infringements. And based on this data, we have created an indicator of how intensively firms are involved in human rights infringements. And therefore, with this indicator, we can finally measure how bad companies are in terms of their behavior vis-à-vis these different audiences that they face. And therefore, we can look at what drives those behaviors and what are the consequences of those behaviors. We can use them in econometric analysis, for instance, to matching those data and those information with other firm-level data that are normally available through secondary sources. So based on our research, we have good news and bad news. The bad news is that we've been thinking for many years that companies that are under financial distress would misbehave. Okay, so the conventional story is that if a company is underperforming, it will have extra motivations for undertaking risks to be able to catch up and to, start performing better and better. And so the risks that human rights infringements entail a risk, because on the one hand, infringing human rights, the company can cut costs, for instance, access resources, for instance, but they have a risk, because if they get caught, then there will be a penalty in terms of the judiciary, but also there will be a reputational penalty. So normally we would think of companies that are underperforming as companies that are more likely to be involved in such infringements. And so that's the conventional view. What we are trying to, or been trying to do, is to see whether it is indeed companies that perform better than industry average who could be involved more into infringements of human rights. We had this idea based on some of the evidence that we have top-tier companies at the verge of competition, very reputable actors, very innovative actors being actually involved in huge controversies of human rights. I mean, if I think about Volkswagen or Monsanto or other examples that you come up with, it's clear that there is something that is not functioning also with the companies that are at the top of the competition. Okay. And with our data, we could find positive evidence of that it is companies that are better performers in the market that are more likely to misbehave, to keep up being the best performers in the future, for instance. So that reverses some of the conventional knowledge about these issues, and I think it's very interesting because it leads to rethink also the way capitalism works. And normally the best competitors are portrayed as the winning models of capitalism, and instead we're seeing that they are not working as they should be working, or they are intended to work for a well-functioning society. So that raises a number of very interesting intellectual as well as policy issues. And the next step is to see whether these companies that are misbehaving are also rewarding abnormally their corporate elites. So CEOs, executives, majority shareholders, because then if there is such an evidence, then we can really rethink the way we consider capitalism functioning, and we can have better policies to address those problems, and we can, try to debunk some of the conventional knowledge about those issues. The good news, though, is that companies tend to behave better when they operate in countries that are stronger institutionally, especially when they have strong speech and press freedom. So they really take care of the context where they operate, they strategize on their behavior, and therefore they're less likely to be involved in controversies over human rights, precisely in the countries where they know that they will have reputational issues if these things get discovered. One of the good news is that when you consider companies' self-regulatory institutions like corporate social responsibility, we do find that companies, when they have CSR policies in place, they are less likely to be involved in the worst form of human rights infringements. That would be gross human rights violations, which we consider to be cases of slavery, of child labor, arbitrary assassination, of like it happens with unionists, for instance, in some cases. So when they have CSR, they're less likely to be involved in those kinds of very bad abuses. But at the same time, they are more likely to be involved in the other, set of abuses that are not as gross, as serious as those ones. So they could be involved more in gender discrimination issues or in lack of safety standard of work and so on. And that's possibly because companies use CSR as a sort of reputational insurance, basically. So it would be that they use CSR to hedge against reputational damages or reputational risks if they get discovered in those kind of less serious human rights abuses. Whereas it seems that CSR, anyway, is a form of disciplining companies against the most serious forms of human rights infringements, which is, to a certain extent, is good news to me.